The gentle hum of the car's engine filled the air as Mrs. Anderson drove down Maple Street, stealing glances at her daughter through the rearview mirror. Little Zara sat in the back seat, her fingers dancing in the air as she practiced the piano piece she had just learned. The afternoon sun painted golden streaks across their faces, and the 8-year-old's eyes sparkled with excitement about her upcoming recital. "Mommy, do you think I'll remember all the notes?" Zara asked, hugging her sheet music close to her chest. The pages were already worn at the edges from constant practice, covered in colorful sticky notes and careful pencil markings. Mrs. Anderson smiled warmly. "Baby, you've practiced that piece so many times, I bet you could play it in your sleep." She adjusted the air conditioning, letting the cool breeze sweep through the car. The familiar scent of Zara's favorite strawberry shampoo mixed with the fresh leather of their new car filled the air. The streets were quiet that Sunday afternoon, with only a few neighbors out walking their dogs or tending to their gardens. Mrs. Anderson had chosen this neighborhood carefully 3 years ago. Good schools, friendly community, and most importantly, a safe place for Zara to grow up. They had their weekend routine down perfectly. Piano lessons with Ms. Wu at 2, then a quick stop at their favorite ice cream shop, and finally home for their traditional Sunday movie night. Today had been especially good. Zara had mastered a particularly tricky part of Mozart's sonata, and Ms. Wu had praised her progress. The pride in Zara's voice as she called her grandmother right after the lesson to share the news made Mrs. Anderson's heart swell. A successful corporate lawyer by day, she worked hard to give Zara every opportunity she could, just as her own parents had done for her. "Can we practice one more time when we get home?" Zara asked, already humming the melody. Her small feet tapped against the car seat, keeping time with the music in her head. "Ms. Wu says if I do really well at the recital, I might get to play at the winter showcase." Mrs. Anderson checked her watch. 3:45 p.m. They had plenty of time before dinner. "Of course we can, sweetheart. Maybe we can even record it and send it to Auntie." She knew her sister, who lived across the country, would love to see her niece's progress. The car rolled to a stop at a red light, and Mrs. Anderson used the moment to grab her water bottle. The day was warmer than usual for early spring, and the weatherman had promised it would stay this way all week. Perfect for the park playdate they had planned with Zara's friends on Wednesday. Everything felt right in their little world at that moment. The weekend stretching ahead of them, full of possibilities. The promise of ice cream and movies. The simple joy of a mother and daughter sharing a peaceful Sunday drive. Mrs. Anderson had no way of knowing that in just a few minutes, their perfect afternoon would take an unexpected turn. One that would test her strength, her dignity, and her ability to protect her daughter while standing up for what's right. The light turned green, and she pressed gently on the gas pedal, her heart light as Zara continued humming in the backseat. Their favorite ice cream shop was just around the corner, and she could already imagine the smile on Zara's face as she ordered her usual double scoop of mint chocolate chip. But fate had different plans for them that afternoon, plans that would turn their ordinary Sunday into something much more significant. Just as Mrs. Anderson turned onto Oak Boulevard, red and blue lights started flashing in her rearview mirror. Her heart skipped a beat, but she remained calm, knowing exactly what to do. She'd had this conversation with her daughter before, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. "Baby, remember what we practiced," she said softly, carefully pulling over to the curb. The afternoon sun still shone brightly, and several neighbors were out walking their dogs, some slowing down to watch. "Yes, Mommy," Zara whispered from the backseat, clutching her sheet music tighter. "Stay calm and quiet." Her small voice trembled slightly, but she sat up straight, just like they'd practiced. Mrs. Anderson went through her mental checklist. Turn off the engine, hands visible on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, registration and license ready in the center console. She could hear heavy boots approaching on the pavement, not one but two sets. Taking a deep breath, she pressed the button to lower her window. "Keep your hands where I can see them. came a gruff voice from her left side. Mrs. Anderson noticed both officers had their hands resting on their weapons, even though she'd followed every protocol perfectly. She glanced at her rearview mirror, catching Zara's wide-eyed reflection. "Good afternoon, officers," Mrs. Anderson said clearly, her voice steady despite the tension building in her shoulders. "May I ask why I've been pulled over today?" The taller officer, his badge reading Officer P, leaned down to peer into her car. His eyes swept over the interior, lingering on the leather seats and the designer purse on the passenger side. "License and registration," he demanded, ignoring her question. "Of course. My registration is in the console, and my license is in my purse. I'm going to reach for them now, if that's okay." She narrated her movements carefully, just as she'd learned to do. The second officer circled to the passenger side, shining his flashlight into the back seat where Zara sat frozen, her sheet music crumpled in her small hands. Mrs. Anderson could feel her daughter's fear, could sense her confusion about why they were being treated this way when they'd done nothing wrong. They were just 3 blocks from their home, on streets they drove every day, in a car she'd worked hard to earn. "This your car?" Officer P asked, studying her license with obvious skepticism. His partner continued shining the flashlight around the car's interior, despite the bright daylight making it completely unnecessary. "Yes, sir. I purchased it 6 months ago from the dealership on Madison Avenue." She kept her voice level, professional, the same voice she used in courtrooms when opposing counsel tried to rattle her. The radio on Officer P's shoulder crackled to life, but he ignored it, instead asking, "And where are you headed?" His tone suggested there was only one right answer, though they both knew he had no right to question her destination. "We're returning home from my daughter's piano lesson. We live just 3 blocks from here, on Maple Street." Mrs. Anderson felt a familiar weight in her chest, the burden of having to justify her presence in her own neighborhood. More neighbors had gathered now, some pretending to water their lawns or check their mail, others openly watching. Mrs. Anderson could see Mrs. Chen from across the street standing on her porch, phone in hand, clearly recording the interaction. The afternoon had shifted from a celebration of Zara's musical progress to yet another lesson in dignity under pressure. The second officer tapped on the passenger window, making Zara jump. "Roll down this window," he ordered. Mrs. Anderson's hand moved to the control panel, her heart racing not for herself, but for her daughter. She knew what was coming. She'd lived it before, seen it happen to others. But this time was different. This time, her baby girl was watching, and what happened next would shape how Zara saw the world for years to come. The situation took a sharp turn when Officer P handed back Mrs. Anderson's license and registration with a sneer. "Pretty fancy car for this neighborhood," he said, his tone dripping with suspicion. "Must be nice to afford something like this on a... What did you say you do for a living?" Mrs. Anderson felt her jaw tighten, but kept her voice steady. "I didn't say, officer, because you didn't ask. I'm an attorney." She watched his expression shift slightly, but he quickly masked it with another scowl. The second officer had moved closer to Zara's window, his flashlight beam still dancing across the interior. "You got any other paperwork for this vehicle?" he asked, despite already having seen the registration. "These luxury cars, they go missing all the time, you understand." In the backseat, Zara's lower lip trembled. Her sheet music lay forgotten on her lap as she watched the officers through frightened eyes. Mrs. Anderson could see her daughter's reflection in the rearview mirror, and it made something deep inside her chest burn with a mother's protective fury. "I think we both know this isn't about the car," Mrs. Anderson said quietly, her words carrying the weight of countless similar experiences. She reached slowly for her phone, making sure both officers could see her movements. "I'm going to record this interaction now, for everyone's safety." Officer P's face hardened. "Ma'am, step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his hand moving to his belt. The second officer straightened up, adopting an aggressive stance that made Zara whimper softly. "Am I being detained?" Mrs. Anderson asked clearly, her phone now recording. "Or am I free to go? Because if I'm not being detained, my daughter and I would like to continue home." She gestured to their house, visible just 3 doors down. "Listen here." Officer P leaned closer to her window, his voice low and threatening. "You people come into nice neighborhoods like this, driving cars you got no business driving." A door slammed nearby, and Mrs. Chen from across the street called out, "Everything okay over here?" "Mrs. Anderson, do you need anything?" Other neighbors had gathered too, phones raised, witnessing what was unfolding. The second officer shifted uncomfortably, aware of the growing audience. But Officer P seemed to grow more agitated. "This doesn't concern any of you," he barked at the onlookers. "Move along." "My daughter and I live right there." Mrs. Anderson pointed again, her voice carrying clearly in the tense afternoon air. "That blue house with the white trim. Where we've lived for 3 years. Where I pay my taxes. Where I'm raising my child." Officer P scoffed. "Yeah? Well, must be in the wrong neighborhood then. Because." A sob from the backseat cut through his words. Zara had started crying, silent tears rolling down her cheeks as she watched her mother being treated this way. The sight of her daughter's tears changed something in Mrs. Anderson's demeanor. "Officer," she said, her voice taking on the sharp edge she usually reserved for cross-examinations, "I'd like your badge numbers, both of you, and your supervisor's contact information. Now." She held her phone steady, still recording. "I'm sure the department will be very interested in how you've conducted yourselves today." The second officer started to back away, sensing the shift in power. But Officer P doubled down. "Is that a threat?" he demanded, his face reddening. "No, officer," Mrs. Anderson replied calmly. "It's a promise. One I'm fully qualified to keep, given that I specialize in civil rights law." She paused, letting that sink in. "Now, unless you're charging me with something, my daughter and I would like to go home. We have a piano recital to practice for." The air crackled with tension as Officer P processed this new information. More neighbors had gathered, more phones were recording, and somewhere in the distance, a car engine revved, perhaps another patrol car approaching. The next few moments would determine whether this incident ended with dignity or escalated into something much worse, and Mrs. Anderson knew exactly which outcome she was going to fight for. Time seemed to slow down as Mrs. Anderson watched her daughter's tears in the rearview mirror. Every fiber of her being wanted to turn around and comfort Zara, but she knew she had to handle this situation carefully, not just for their immediate safety, but to show her daughter how to stand up to injustice with dignity. "My body camera's on, ma'am," the second officer suddenly announced, taking a small step back. His words carried a hint of warning, but whether it was meant for her or his partner wasn't clear. "I'm glad to hear that," Mrs. Anderson replied evenly. "I hope it's been recording this entire interaction. It'll make an excellent exhibit in my complaint to the department." Her hand remained steady holding the phone, even as her heart raced beneath her calm exterior. A new police car pulled up quietly behind them, its lights off. Mrs. Anderson recognized the vehicle. It belonged to Lieutenant Wilson, a regular at community meetings. She'd spoken with him several times about improving police-community relations. The timing couldn't have been better. Officer P was still fuming, but his partner had noticed the lieutenant's arrival. "Maybe we should," he started to say, but Officer P cut him off. "Listen here," Officer P growled, leaning closer to Mrs. Anderson's window. "You might think you're something special with your fancy car and your law degree, but—" "Officer," Mrs. Anderson interrupted, her voice carrying the weight of years of courtroom experience, "I'm going to give you a chance to step back and think very carefully about your next words. My daughter is watching. Your body cameras are recording. Our neighbors are witnessing. And your lieutenant just arrived." The mention of the lieutenant made Officer P straighten up quickly. Mrs. Anderson continued, her voice clear and controlled. I want both of your badge numbers, your supervisor's information, and a clear explanation of why I was pulled over today. Or we can discuss all of this in detail during my meeting with the chief tomorrow morning. In the growing crowd of neighbors, someone clapped. Mrs. Chen was still recording from her porch, and Mr. Rodriguez from next door had walked over to stand nearby, his presence a silent show of support. The community's response was exactly what Mrs. Anderson had worked to build over the past 3 years. Neighbors looking out for each other, standing together against injustice. Mommy. Zara's small voice came from the back seat, stronger now despite her tears. Are we going to be okay? Yes, baby, Mrs. Anderson answered, never taking her eyes off the officers. We're going to be just fine. Remember what I always tell you about standing up for what's right. Lieutenant Wilson was approaching now, his face serious as he took in the scene. Officer P's demeanor changed dramatically at the sight of his superior, but Mrs. Anderson wasn't finished. She had a choice to make. She could let this incident slide, go home, and try to forget it happened. Or she could use this moment to create real change, not just for herself and Zara, but for their entire community. Lieutenant, she called out, her voice carrying clearly in the tense afternoon air. I'd like to file a formal complaint about the conduct of these officers. And I think we need to have that discussion about department-wide bias training that we talked about at last month's community meeting. The weight of her words hung in the air. This wasn't just about one traffic stop anymore. This was about standing up for every parent who'd ever had to explain discrimination to their child, every person who'd been made to feel like they didn't belong in their own neighborhood, every community that had suffered in silence. In the backseat, Zara had stopped crying. She sat up straighter, watching her mother with a new understanding in her young eyes. This was the lesson Mrs. Anderson had always hoped to teach her daughter, not just how to face injustice, but how to fight it with grace, intelligence, and unwavering dignity. Lieutenant Wilson approached with measured steps, his experienced eyes taking in every detail of the scene. The crowd of neighbors had grown, their phones still recording, creating a circle of silent support around Mrs. Anderson's car. Mrs. Anderson, the lieutenant said, his tone professional but concerned. What seems to be the problem here? Before she could answer, Officer P jumped in. Just a routine traffic stop, sir. We were checking. I wasn't asking you, officer. Lieutenant Wilson cut him off firmly. Mrs. Anderson. Drawing a deep breath, she spoke clearly, her lawyer's training evident in every word. I was pulled over 3 doors from my home. No reason was given. These officers have made several inappropriate comments about my presence in this neighborhood and implied that my car must be stolen. All of this in front of my 8-year-old daughter. The lieutenant's face darkened. He'd worked hard to build community trust, and in one afternoon, these officers were threatening to undo years of progress. Your dash cam and body cameras are on, he asked the officers, though it wasn't really a question. Yes, sir, the second officer replied quickly, while Officer P stood rigid, his earlier bravado evaporating under his superior's stern gaze. Good, Mrs. Anderson interjected. Because I'd like to formally state that I believe I've been racially profiled. I have my own recording of this interaction, and as you can see, she gestured to the neighbors, plenty of witnesses. From the back seat, Zara watched the scene unfold with growing understanding. Her mother's voice hadn't raised once, yet she commanded respect from everyone present. The same strength she showed in courtrooms was on full display right here on their street. Officers, step back to your vehicle, Lieutenant Wilson ordered. Once they were out of earshot, he turned back to Mrs. Anderson. I apologize for this incident. You know this isn't what we've been working toward in our community meetings. No, it isn't, she agreed, still holding her phone steady. And that's exactly why I can't let it slide. Not when my daughter is watching. Not when every child in this neighborhood is watching. More neighbors had joined the scene. Mrs. Lee from the corner house brought bottles of water. Mr. Rodriguez's teenage son had set up a lawn chair near the sidewalk, making it clear he wasn't going anywhere. This was community support in action, exactly what they'd talked about in all those neighborhood meetings. I want a formal investigation, Mrs. Anderson continued, her voice carrying to the gathered crowd. Not just of this incident, but of the pattern it represents. These officers need more than just a reprimand, Lieutenant. They need proper training. And so does every other officer who thinks it's okay to traumatize a child because they can't believe her mother belongs in this neighborhood. Lieutenant Wilson nodded slowly, pulling out his notebook. I'll need your statement, and I'd like copies of your recording. You'll have them, she assured him, along with a formal complaint filed first thing tomorrow morning. I think it's time we implemented that community oversight committee we discussed last month. The afternoon sun was starting to soften, casting long shadows across the street. What had started as a simple drive home from piano lessons had transformed into a moment of community activism. Mrs. Anderson could see Zara watching intently, absorbing every word, every action. Mommy, Zara called out softly. Can I tell the lieutenant about what happened? Mrs. Anderson felt a surge of pride. Her daughter wasn't just watching her stand up to injustice. She was ready to add her own voice. This was how change began, not with shouting or violence, but with steady determination and the courage to speak up. Of course, baby, she said, finally turning to meet her daughter's eyes. Lieutenant Wilson needs to hear your side of the story, too. Everyone's voice matters in making things right. The gathered neighbors murmured in approval. This wasn't just about one traffic stop anymore. This was about a community coming together, about a mother teaching her daughter that standing up for what's right doesn't mean standing alone, and about turning an act of discrimination into a catalyst for real change. As Zara began to tell her story, her small voice grew stronger with each word. She sat up straight in her car seat, still holding her piano sheets close, but now they seemed more like a badge of courage than something to hide behind. We were just coming back from piano, she explained to Lieutenant Wilson, who had crouched down to her eye level beside the car. I learned a new song today, and Mommy promised we'd get ice cream. But then the lights started flashing, and the officer. Her voice wobbled slightly, but she pressed on. He made me feel scared in my own street. Mrs. Anderson watched through the rearview mirror as her daughter spoke, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and pain. This wasn't a lesson she had wanted to teach her child, at least not this way, but Zara was handling it with remarkable grace. And what did your mom do? Lieutenant Wilson asked gently, his notebook open but momentarily forgotten, as he listened to the child's perspective. She stayed calm, just like she taught me to, Zara replied, sitting up even straighter. She used her lawyer voice. That's what I call it when she talks like she does in court. And she didn't let them make her feel small, even when they were being mean about our car and our house. In the background, Officer P shifted uncomfortably, the weight of a child's honest testimony clearly affecting him more than any adult's accusations could have. His partner had the decency to look ashamed, especially when Zara mentioned how the flashlight had scared her. Mrs. Chen stepped forward from the gathering of neighbors. I have it all on video, she announced. The way they approached the car, hands on their weapons, even though it's just a mother and child. In broad daylight. On our street. Lieutenant Wilson nodded, standing back up. Mrs. Anderson, would you be willing to present this at next week's police commission meeting? I think they need to hear directly from you and your daughter about how this kind of interaction affects our community. Actually, Mrs. Anderson replied, a plan forming in her mind. I have a better idea. Next week is our community town hall. Why don't we invite the police commission there? Let them come to our neighborhood, sit in our community center, and hear not just from me, but from everyone who has a story to tell. The gathered neighbors murmured in agreement. Mr. Rodriguez raised his hand. I'll bring my famous empanadas, he offered, drawing smiles from the crowd. Nothing brings people together like good food and honest conversation. And I can play my piano piece. Zara chimed in unexpectedly. The one about hope and courage. Ms. Wu says music can touch people's hearts when words aren't enough. Mrs. Anderson felt tears prick at her eyes, but these were different from the angry ones she'd held back earlier. These were tears of hope, of seeing her community come together, of watching her daughter transform a moment of fear into an opportunity for change. Lieutenant Wilson was already making notes on his pad. I'll make sure the commission is there. And these officers, he glanced back at his subordinates, will be attending as well. Not as security, but as participants. Sometimes the best lessons come from listening to the people we've hurt. Officer P started to protest, but his partner put a hand on his arm, shaking his head. The younger officer seemed to understand that this was about something bigger than their pride or their badges. Now, Lieutenant Wilson continued, I believe there was mention of ice cream. Would anyone object if I asked Mrs. Anderson and Zara to lead a community ice cream outing? Seems like we could all use a reminder of what makes this neighborhood special. The tension in the air finally broke. Children who had been watching from behind their parents' legs started to bounce excitedly. Even some of the adults who had been filming put their phones away, smiling at the suggestion. Can we, Mommy? Zara asked, her earlier tears completely forgotten in the face of potential ice cream and community celebration. Can we show everyone my favorite flavor? Mrs. Anderson looked around at her neighbors, now friends, allies, and partners in creating change, and felt something powerful taking root. This was how you turned pain into progress. One street, one community, one honest conversation at a time. The next morning, Mrs. Anderson sat at her home office desk, surrounded by papers and her laptop open to her email. She had been up since dawn, turning last night's incident into action. The video from her phone was carefully uploaded, along with videos shared by neighbors. Her formal complaint sat ready to be filed, every detail documented with a lawyer's precision. Mommy? Zara appeared in the doorway, still in her favorite butterfly pajamas. Are you writing about yesterday? Yes, baby. Come here. Mrs. Anderson patted her lap, and Zara climbed up, looking at the computer screen. I'm making sure what happened to us helps make things better for everyone. The phone rang. It was the local news station. They had gotten wind of the incident through social media. Mrs. Anderson's first instinct was to decline the call, but then she remembered Zora's brave voice yesterday, telling her story to Lieutenant Wilson. Good morning, she answered professionally. As she listened to the reporter, she opened her email to find messages of support flooding in from neighbors. The community chat group was buzzing with plans for the upcoming town hall. Yes, I would be willing to discuss the incident, she told the reporter, but only if we focus on solutions, not just the problem. This isn't about shaming individual officers. It's about changing the system. After hanging up, she noticed Zara watching her intently. You're using your changing the world voice, her daughter observed with a small smile. That's even stronger than your lawyer voice. A knock at the door interrupted them. It was Mrs. Chen, holding a basket of fresh muffins. The neighborhood moms group is meeting at my house in an hour, she announced. We're planning the town hall agenda. And guess what? The police commissioner just confirmed he's coming. Mrs. Anderson's phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Lieutenant Wilson. The two officers from yesterday had requested to meet with her privately before the town hall. They wanted to apologize, not because they were ordered to, but because they'd spent the night thinking out Zara's words. Mrs. Chen, Zara piped up, can I practice my piano piece at your house while moms meet? I want it to be perfect for the town hall. Of course, sweetheart. Mrs. Wu even called this morning. She wants to come support you at the performance. As they prepared to head over to Mrs. Chen's house, Mrs. Anderson's email pinged one more time. It was from a civil rights organization in the city. They had heard about the incident and wanted to use it as a model for community police dialogue in other neighborhoods. "Mommy," Zara said as they walked down their front steps, "remember how you always tell me that bad things can lead to good changes if we're brave enough to speak up?" "I do remember, Vavy." "Why?" "Well, I was scared yesterday, really scared. But now look, everyone's coming together, and we're going to make things better. That's what being brave means, right?" They passed the spot where they'd been pulled over just yesterday. Now it looked different. Not a place of fear, but a place of transformation. Neighbors waved from their porches. Mr. Rodriguez was already setting up chairs in his front yard for an impromptu planning meeting. "Being brave," Mrs. Anderson replied, squeezing her daughter's hand, "is exactly what you did. You showed everyone that even a little girl's voice can help change the world." At Mrs. Chen's house, the living room was already filling with neighbors. Some brought food, others brought ideas, but everyone brought determination. On the coffee table, someone had placed a sign reading "Change starts at home." Mrs. Anderson watched as Zara headed straight for Mrs. Chen's piano, her sheet music clutched proudly in her hands. The sweet notes of her practice piece floated through the house, providing a soundtrack to the buzz of community organizing. This wasn't just about filing complaints or making headlines. This was about building something stronger than fear. A community where every voice mattered, where every child felt safe, and where even the hardest conversations could lead to real understanding. The community center buzzed with energy on the evening of the town hall meeting. Every chair was filled, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. Mr. Rodriguez's empanadas were disappearing fast from the snack table, and the atmosphere was charged with purpose. At the front of the room, Zara sat at the piano, her small fingers running through quiet warm-up exercises. She wore her favorite blue dress, the one she'd chosen specially for making history, as she called it. Mrs. Anderson watched her daughter from the podium, amazed at how much confidence the little girl had found in just 1 week. "Ready?" Lieutenant Wilson asked, approaching the podium. The police commissioner and several other officials sat in the front row, along with both officers from the incident. Officer P looked uncomfortable in his civilian clothes, but his partner seemed more open, even nodding at some of the community members he recognized. "More than ready," Mrs. Anderson replied, adjusting her microphone. The room gradually fell silent as she cleared her throat. But before she could speak, Zora's voice rang out clear and strong. "Can I start, Mommy?" with the song. The audience murmured warmly as Zara positioned herself at the piano. The piece she'd been practicing, the one about hope and courage, filled the room. Her small hands moved confidently across the keys, and Mrs. Anderson noticed several people wiping their eyes. Music had a way of opening hearts that words alone couldn't reach. When the last note faded, Mrs. Anderson began her speech. "A week ago, my daughter and I were stopped 3 doors from our home. But this meeting isn't about that one incident. It's about making sure no child ever feels afraid in their own neighborhood again." She shared their story, not with anger, but with determination. Then community members stood up, one by one, sharing their own experiences. Mrs. Chen played her video of the incident. The police commissioner leaned forward in his chair, taking notes, his face growing more serious with each testimony. Then something unexpected happened. Officer P stood up, his hands shaking slightly as he faced the crowd. "I want to apologize," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Not just for last week, but for every time I let my prejudices affect my job. Hearing that little girl play just now," he glanced at Zara, "it reminded me of my own daughter. And I felt ashamed thinking about how I would feel if someone made her feel afraid in her own neighborhood." His partner stood up next. "We've requested to be part of the new community patrol program," he announced. "If you'll have us, we want to learn to serve this community the right way." The police commissioner took the podium next, outlining immediate changes: mandatory bias training, community oversight committees, regular town halls, and a new mentorship program pairing officers with local families. But most importantly, he said, looking directly at Zara, we're starting a youth advisory board. Because sometimes it takes a child's honesty to help adults see the truth. Zara beamed from her piano bench, and Mrs. Anderson felt tears prick her eyes. This was more than they'd hoped for. Real change, starting right here in their community. As the formal meeting ended and people mingled over refreshments, kids gathered around the piano where Zara was teaching them the basic notes of her song. Officers chatted with residents, exchanging phone numbers and making plans for coffee. Mr. Rodriguez was explaining his empanada recipe to the police commissioner. "Look, Mommy," Zara called out, pointing to the diverse group of children now surrounding the piano. Everyone's learning the song together. Ms. Wu says when people make music together, they become friends without even trying. Mrs. Anderson watched as her daughter's simple observation played out across the room. People who had been strangers a week ago were now planning neighborhood projects together. The walls between us and them were crumbling, replaced by something stronger: understanding, respect, and genuine desire for change. This wasn't just a meeting, it was the beginning of a new chapter for their community. And it had started with a mother and daughter brave enough to turn an unfair traffic stop into an opportunity for transformation. 6 months later, Mrs. Anderson stood in her front yard, watching Zara teach piano to Officer P's daughter under the big oak tree. They had moved the old piano onto the porch for summer practice sessions, and the neighborhood kids often gathered to learn music together. Who would have thought? Mrs. Chen said, joining her with 2 glasses of lemonade. That day changed everything, didn't it? Indeed, it had. The neighborhood had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The new community patrol program had become a model for other districts. Officers now walked their beats, knowing residents by name, joining block parties, and even attending piano recitals. "Did you see the news this morning?" Mrs. Chen asked. "They're implementing our program in 5 other cities. Your daughter's piano peace protest, that's what they're calling it." Mrs. Anderson smiled, remembering how that challenging day had turned into something beautiful. The front yards along their street had become gathering spaces. Mr. Rodriguez's weekly cookouts now included off-duty officers sharing stories with neighbors. Even Officer P, once so angry and prejudiced, had become one of their strongest allies in promoting community policing. "Mommy," Zara called from the porch. "Come listen. We're playing the Hope Song as a duet." She sat beside Officer P's daughter, their small hands moving together across the keys, creating harmony where there had once been discord. Lieutenant Wilson, now promoted to captain, drove by slowly, waving at the gathering. The police car no longer brought tension to the street. Instead, it was just another part of their community. He parked and joined the growing audience on the lawn. "You know," he said quietly to Mrs. Anderson, "that day could have gone so differently. Your courage, your dignity, and especially your daughter's pure heart. It changed not just our department, but all of us." The music swelled from the porch, where more children had gathered to sing along. They had added words to Zara's piece now, a simple song about friendship, understanding, and standing up for what's right. Mrs. Anderson thought back to that tense afternoon 6 months ago. "Sometimes," she replied, "the worst moments can bring out the best in people, if we're brave enough to look for the good." A news van pulled up slowly. They still came occasionally to document the neighborhood's transformation. But today wasn't about headlines. It was about 2 little girls playing piano together, about former adversaries sharing lemonade on a summer afternoon, about a community that had learned to see beyond differences. "Next week's town hall is going to be special," Captain Wilson mentioned. "The governor's office wants to learn more about our program. They're thinking about making it state law, requiring all police departments to implement community engagement initiatives." And it all started with a little girl's piano lesson, Mrs. Chen added, wiping happy tears from her eyes. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the lawn, Neighbors brought out chairs and blankets. This had become their new tradition. Evening concerts on Mrs. Anderson's porch, where music and friendship erased the boundaries that once divided them. Zara stood up from the piano, taking a small bow. "Mom," she called out, "remember what you told me that day? About how being brave doesn't mean being perfect, it means doing what's right even when you're scared." "I remember, baby." "Well, I'm not scared anymore. Not of anything. Because I know our whole neighborhood is like one big family now, and families stick together." The wisdom in her daughter's words struck Mrs. Anderson deeply. This was the true victory, not just policy changes or programs, but the fundamental shift in how people saw each other. Their story had proved that change was possible, that hearts could open, that communities could heal. As darkness fell, porch lights clicked on up and down the street, and the piano music continued to float through the evening air. This was their new normal, a neighborhood where every child felt safe, where every voice mattered, and where music had the power to bring people together, one note at a time.